So, we Christians sometimes have our own lingo. Words that we use that it's not always obvious what we're talking about to someone from the outside. And grace is one of those words. I mean, normally when we hear the word grace, we may think of that air, of the way somebody carries themselves, and we refer to them as being graceful. Or we might think of that brief prayer we say before we eat, giving thanks to God for what He's provided. But we use grace as Christians in so many other ways. We sing about amazing grace. Paul, in all his letters, greets the people saying, "Grace and peace to you from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ." Grace is something that we study in Sunday school. Our adult ed class is working through a book that's all about grace. And yet grace it's hard to define. Usually the way people will define grace is saying, well, grace is a free gift. Grace is what comes from God with no strings attached. Grace is that which we receive that we don't deserve. But I think the best way to understand grace is to look at Jesus. And to look at how Jesus interacts with people. And that is what we see in our passage today. Jesus and his disciples are traveling through Samaria. And at midday, he sits down by this well. And a Samaritan woman comes to the well to draw water. And Jesus talks to her. He asks her for the drink. And in a rather understated way, John says, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. It was worse than that. It's not that Jews just didn't associate with Samaritans or Samaritans with Jews. They despised each other. Think of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, the war that just completed, the rhetoric you hear from that. It was worse than that. Jews and Samaritans did not have anything to do with one another. You see, Samaritans lived in that northern part of what had once been the kingdom of Israel. And in that part of Palestine that had been the kingdom of Israel, the people had worshipped the God of their ancestors. But they did so in a way that was not pleasing to God because they built an idol. And they put it in this temple that they erected in this city that was the capital of Israel, a city called Samaria. And because of their sin, God allowed the Assyrians to take over that kingdom of Israel. And the Assyrians came in and they took over the northern kingdom. And they shipped out all the people who lived there. The nation of Israel was sent away. And they brought in others from other parts of the Assyrian Empire. Strangers, foreigners, people who were not descendants of Abraham. And when we read about what happened there in the Bible, we find out that these people came in and wild beasts were just slaughtering them because they weren't worshiping God. And so the Assyrian emperor had priests from Israel go in and teach them how to worship God. And so for the Jews living in Judah looking at these people in Samaria, they were foreigners. They brought in their foreign practices and polluted the worship of God with their pagan ways. They weren't related to them. And then after Judah had been taken into captivity by Babylon, and after 70 years they came back, the Samaritans tried to keep them from building a temple and building the walls around Jerusalem. To say that Jews and Samaritans did not associate with one another is an understatement. Jesus had every reason as a Jew to not even acknowledge the existence of this woman who came to the well. But he asks her for a drink. And she doesn't respond in the kindest way. She says, "What are you talking about? You're a Jew." Essentially, when she says here, "You are a Jew and I a Samaritan woman, how can you ask me for a drink?" She's saying, "Are you kidding? Why would I do anything for you? You're a Jew." But how does Jesus respond? With grace. He goes on and explains to her, if you knew the gift of God and who I am, you'd ask for living water. He responds to her with kindness, with grace, with gentleness. And this woman needed that. When Jesus was sitting at the well, it was noon. And here this woman is coming out of the village to collect water by herself in the heat of the day. That's not the way it was done. Women would go to the well to collect water early in the morning or late in the evening when it was cool. And they would go out together. It was a time of socializing, of sharing news, of just being together. It was a kind of community gathering. But not for this woman. She came out in the heat of the day by herself. And we don't know a lot about her. But we can tell from that this woman was ostracized. She wasn't really part of her community. And we don't know for sure why, but Jesus seemed to have an idea. And he tells her to go get her husband. And when she says, "I have no husband," he said, "That's right, you've had 5 husbands. And the one you're with now is not your husband." But again, Jesus responds to her with grace. He doesn't say, "You terrible person, look at all these husbands you've had." He doesn't say, "You're living in sin now." He simply tells her the truth, the conditions in which she exists, and the reason why it is probably that she is ostracized by her community. Even her sin he treats with grace. And then to add grace upon grace, Jesus tells this woman that he's the Messiah. This is the first person that we know of to be told by Jesus that he is the Messiah. The first person to be told this good news is a woman and a Samaritan. Grace upon grace. And as he tells her about the living water, that this living water will well up and become a spring that wells up to eternal life, tell her that the grace begets grace. The grace he has showered on her wells up and becomes more grace as she goes back to her community and tells them who she has met. Come and see this man. Come and see this one who knows all about me. Maybe he's the Messiah. And this woman who is outcast, who is essentially an outsider, is listened to. And people do what she says, and they come and they meet Jesus. And we're told that many believed and became disciples. And later in the book of Acts, we find out that community of disciples that she started, as she shared the grace that had been given to her, was still there. That she had become a church planter. Grace upon grace. Jesus treats this woman with respect, with grace, even though she should be an enemy, even though she should be an opponent, even though she'd been ostracized by her community. She doesn't deserve the kindness he shows, but he gives it to her anyway. And that grace begets grace. That is what we are called to as followers of Jesus. We who have received God's grace, God's abundant grace, should have that grace well up in us to become streams of living water that flow out from us and splash on the people we encounter. Whether we know them or not, whether we like them or not, whether they deserve it or not. I was reading this week about a man named David Neff. And Neff is an editor of Christian magazine. He'd gone to a conference at Yale University, a conference that was entitled Loving God and Neighbor Together, and it was a Christian-Muslim dialogue. And they were there talking about love and compassion and mercy and what those are like in their traditions, in Christianity versus Islam. And he pointed out that the Christian participants, we've been taught by Jesus that our love should be indiscriminate. That yes, we love our friends, but Jesus says love your enemy. Do good to those who hate you. Our love should be indiscriminate, just like Jesus' love was indiscriminate, and he showed grace to this Samaritan woman. And he goes on to point out that may not be the way we generally behave, but it's the way we've learned to think of ourselves. It's the standard against which we measure ourselves. And then he goes on to say that Muslim participants startled us Christians by talking about the limits their religion brought to their compassion. Orphans, widows, and others in need through no fault of their own deserve compassion. But in Islamic ethics, they learn there's no obligation to help the person whose drunkenness or gambling or otherwise unwise behavior has brought them trouble, has put them in difficulty. They don't need to show compassion on those who don't deserve it, who have gotten themselves into trouble, is what they were taught. And the reality is, isn't it, that that's how most of us behave? We show compassion on those we think deserve it. Those who haven't gotten themselves in trouble by their own stupidity, their own sinful behavior. But showing grace to those who don't deserve it, that's not our usual way of doing things, is it? But God's abundant grace begets grace in us. And as we reflect on the kinds of things that Paul talks about, that it's while we were yet sinners that Christ died for us, then we need to be more open-handed with the grace we extend to others. Just about a month ago, you may have seen, there was a couple in Cedar Rapids who went out to dinner to celebrate their anniversary. And they received less than excellent service. 20 minutes before the waitress even brought them water. Not a lot of attention given to them at their table. They received poor service from this waitress, but they noticed that she was also working very hard, serving a lot of tables, and the people around were grumbling about the lousy service they were receiving. And we all know when you receive lousy service, that's what the tip reflects, right? This couple left her a $100 tip. And on the receipt, they said, "We've been there before." They had been there before. They had received grace. And grace begets grace. So this week, as you head out into the world, as you head into your workplace, your place of work, head into your homes, interact with your neighbors, who is God calling you to extend grace to? Who is that person that doesn't deserve it, that gets on your nerves, that has undermined your work, that has said bad things about your family, go out and extend grace to them, because you have received God's abundant grace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.